There is a message sitting in the inbox sent by a man named Brent from Tucson, Arizona, and the first line of it reads, "I am not writing this because I want sympathy. I am writing this because I need someone to understand how a man who spent 30 years making careful, professional decisions can lose nearly everything he has left to a woman he met in a Facebook group." When that message came in, it stopped everything. Because Brent is not the kind of man these stories are usually told about. He is not young, not reckless, not naive about the world. He is 58 years old, a retired civil engineer, a man who built bridges and calculated load tolerances for a living. And yet, somewhere between a quiet divorce and a Colombian coastline he never quite reached, something in him gave way. What happened to Brent Sampson in the months that followed his retirement is not a story about stupidity. It is a story about loneliness, so deep it hollows out a man's judgment from the inside, and about a woman so precisely skilled at filling that hollow that he never once felt the extraction happening. If you've been enjoying the stories I tell, please consider hitting the subscribe button. Your support is crucial for the growth of this channel and helps me dedicate time to making these videos despite my commitment to a full-time job. Thank you for being here. The house in Tucson had never felt smaller than it did the summer after Linda left. That is where the story of Brent Sampson truly begins. Not with a Facebook group or a woman in Cartagena or a real estate prospectus with forged stamps, but with a man standing in his own kitchen at 7 in the morning, making coffee for one, listening to the particular silence of a house that used to hold a marriage. The divorce had been finalized after 24 years, not with violence, not with betrayal in the conventional sense, but with something quieter and in many ways harder to recover from. Linda had sat across from him at the kitchen table where they had eaten thousands of meals together and said in a voice that was almost gentle, "I haven't loved you for a long time." She did not say it with cruelty. She said it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis as a fact that exists independently of anyone's feelings about it, something that had simply been true for a while before it was spoken aloud. Brent had nodded. He had not cried. He had said, "I understand," because he was the kind of man who said things like that, and in some locked-off chamber of himself, he did understand he had felt the same absence for years without ever finding the language for it. He took the house. She took half the retirement account and left with a composure that suggested she had been planning the exit for longer than she let on. Their 2 adult children, a son named Craig, 26, and a daughter named Megan, 29, handled the split with the diplomatic neutrality of people who had seen it coming. Megan moved closer to her mother. Craig called Brent on Sundays, reliably, with the same, slightly too cheerful tone of a man performing normalcy. Neither of them knew what to do with a father who did not ask for help and showed no obvious signs of breaking. 6 months after the divorce, Brent retired from the engineering firm where he had spent the bulk of his professional life. He told himself it was the plan all along. He had always said 60 was the number, and 58 was close enough, and he had the pension, and the timing was right. None of that was entirely untrue. But the truer thing, the thing he did not say to anyone, was that he could not stand one more day in an office where he was respected but not needed, competent but not central, a man whose most important decisions were already made. He had approximately $94,000 in savings, a house he owned outright, and a pension that covered his basic costs without strain. On paper, he had landed softly. In practice, he had nowhere to be and no one waiting for him when he got home. He filled the days the way men of his temperament fill empty time with projects. He refinished the deck. He reorganized the garage with the systematic focus of someone who had once managed construction crews across 3 states. He watched 4 complete documentary series about infrastructure and civil engineering history. He cooked elaborate meals that he ate alone at the kitchen island while reading the news on his phone. He told Craig, on those Sunday calls, that retirement was good, that he was adjusting, that he was thinking about traveling. Craig said that sounded great. Brent said he thought so too. What he did not tell Craig, what he did not tell anyone, was that the retirement had not freed him the way he imagined. It had simply removed the last structure that had been holding the loneliness at a manageable distance. Work had been his social life, his identity, his proof of purpose. Without it, the days stretched out with a flatness that he did not know how to fill with anything that mattered. He was not depressed, exactly. He was erased. He was a man who had defined himself entirely by what he built and who needed him. And now he had built everything he needed, and no one needed him at all. He was not looking for a woman. He was looking for proof that he was still worth something. That distinction, subtle as it sounds, is precisely what made him findable. It started, as so many of these things do now, with a small and ordinary act of curiosity. 8 months after his divorce, on a Tuesday evening in autumn when the Tucson heat had finally softened enough to sit on the refinished deck without discomfort, Brent opened his laptop and watched 3 consecutive YouTube videos about retiring abroad on a fixed income. He was not seriously planning anything. He was the kind of man who researches possibilities the way other people read fiction as a form of imaginative escape, with no immediate intention of application. But the videos were compelling. They talked about Medellin, about Cartagena, about the cost of living and the warmth of the people and the quality of life available to a foreigner with a modest American pension. Something stirred in him. He had been to Bogota once, nearly a decade earlier, for a consulting project. He remembered it vividly, the altitude, the riot of green on the surrounding hillsides, the particular way the city smelled of rain and coffee and diesel exhaust, the startling beauty of it against the chaos. He had eaten a meal alone in a restaurant in the Candelaria neighborhood and felt, for a few hours, genuinely alive in a way that his daily life in Arizona rarely produced. He'd gone home and returned immediately to his normal life and had not thought about it much since. But watching those videos, something about that memory reasserted itself with unexpected force. He searched for Colombia expat communities on Facebook and found a private group called Solo Travel Colombia Expats and Visitors. He requested to join. He was accepted within an hour. And then, with the slightly self-conscious feeling of a man doing something he is not entirely sure about, he typed an introduction post. He wrote that he was recently retired, recently divorced, that he was thinking about seeing more of the world while he still could, that he had heard Colombia was worth it, and that any advice was welcome. He pressed post and closed the laptop and went to bed. He did not know that his post had already been read by someone who was very good at reading posts like his. Her name was Valentina Restrepo Cardenas, and she was 29 years old, and she was, by any reasonable standard of assessment, extraordinarily beautiful. She had grown up in the Laureles neighborhood of Medellin, middle-lower class, the daughter of a woman who worked 3 jobs and a father who was gone by the time Valentina was 12. She had learned, early and efficiently, that the world responded to her differently than it responded to most people, and she had spent her adult life deciding what to do with that. She spoke English well, learned through 2 years managing foreign wedding clients at a boutique event company in Cartagena, polished further through a method she never mentioned to anyone, which was years of watching American and British television with the sound on and the subtitles running simultaneously. Her English had a quality that men consistently described as charming, slightly accented, grammatically careful, occasionally reaching for a word in a way that somehow made the sentences more memorable, not less. What she actually did for a living was not event coordination. What she actually did was operate as the lead romantic agent in a small, tightly organized fraud cell that targeted older foreign men, specifically men who had recently experienced significant emotional loss and were financially stable and emotionally unguarded. The cell had 4 members. They were not criminals in the cinematic sense, no violence, no weapons, no dramatic confrontations. They were closer to a small business with a specialized service model and a very clear target demographic. Valentina was the face. She was the product. Everything else was infrastructure. She did not hate the men she targeted. She felt something more like a clean, practical indifference, the feeling of a tradesperson toward the material they work with. She had built this indifference carefully, over time, because she had found it more useful than either guilt or cruelty. She was not a sociopath. She loved her younger sister, Daniela, with a genuine fierceness. She sent money to her mother every month. She had friends in Medellin who knew her as warm and funny and loyal. The wall she constructed between the woman she was in those relationships and the role she performed in the operation was architectural in its precision. She had built it the same way Brent had built bridges methodically, load-tested, designed to hold. She had an internal timeline. Approximately 18 months of work remained before she would have accumulated enough to purchase a small commercial property and open a legitimate business. She was building toward an exit. This mattered to her in a way she did not examine too closely, because examining it would require acknowledging what she was exiting from, and she had found that particular door more useful kept shut. When she saw Brent's post in the Facebook group, or rather when Hector, her cell's advanced scout who monitored the group for precisely this type of entry point, forwarded it to her with a brief assessment, she read it twice and recognized it immediately. Just retired, just divorced, thinking about seeing more of the world. Every word of it was a signal. The retirement meant time. The divorce meant need. The phrasing, while I still can, meant he was the kind of man who had recently recalibrated his sense of how much life was left and found the number smaller than he had assumed. He was not looking for adventure. He was looking for meaning. Men looking for meaning were the most reliable targets she had ever worked with. She typed a comment on his post. Not flirtatious, that would have been wrong for this profile. Warm, sisterly, informative. She recommended Cartagena for first-timers, mentioned 2 restaurants, offered to answer questions if he had them. She had done this hundreds of times. She knew exactly how it read. Like a helpful local. Like a coincidence. Like the internet occasionally producing something genuinely kind. 2 days later, she sent him a private message with a PDF guide to Colombia's Caribbean coast, a real document, practically useful, something she had assembled from tourism materials for exactly this kind of opening. It cost her nothing, and communicated, without stating it, that she had thought about him after their brief exchange, that she had made something for him, that he was already worth a small investment of her attention. Brent replied within 20 minutes. He said thank you. He said it was incredibly helpful. He said he had not expected that kind of generosity from a stranger. She had counted on exactly that. The first 10 days of their communication had a quality that Brent would later describe, in the message he eventually sent in, as feeling like talking to someone who had known me a long time but had never gotten tired of me. They moved from Facebook to WhatsApp within that first week and a half, Valentina suggesting it casually, mentioning that she found it easier for longer conversations, which was true and also strategic, since WhatsApp communications are harder to track and easier to disappear than Facebook messages. She asked him about his work, his life, his divorce, not intrusively, but with the particular quality of attention that made every question feel like genuine interest rather than data collection. She asked what civil engineering actually involved in practice, because she had always been curious about how infrastructure was planned. She asked what Tucson looked like in different seasons. She asked whether his retirement felt the way he expected it to. He told her things he had not told Craig on those Sunday calls. He told her about the silence in the house. He told her about the deck project, and how finishing it had left him with a feeling he could not quite name. Not satisfaction exactly. More like the absence of the next thing. She listened. Not performatively, or rather, she performed listening so precisely that it was indistinguishable from the real thing, which in practice amounted to the same experience for Brent. She shared calibrated fragments of her own life in return. A demanding job she found meaningful. A small apartment she shared with her sister Daniela. A father who had left when she was 12, and about whom she said very little, but with a weight that implied a great deal. Once, only once, she mentioned loneliness, and then deflected from it quickly, as if she had said more than she meant to. He thought about that deflection for 3 days. He could not have said why. The first video call happened 12 days after her initial comment on his post. It lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. She called from her living room, simply furnished, a framed photograph of a beach visible on the wall behind her. She was wearing a loose blue shirt, and her hair was down, and she looked, Brent would later think, like someone who had not prepared for the call, natural, unguarded, present. The illusion of spontaneity was one of Valentina's most refined skills. She asked him to describe what Tucson looked like at sunset, and she listened to his answer with a quality of visible attention, eyes fully on the camera, occasionally nodding. The slight smile of someone hearing something they find genuinely interesting that Brent had not experienced from another human being, in person or otherwise, in longer than he could accurately calculate. When the call ended, she said simply, "I really liked this. I hope we do it again." No performance, no theatrical warmth, just a statement, clean and direct, that landed in his chest with a precision she had calibrated exactly. He went to bed that night feeling something he identified, cautiously, as happiness. He did not examine it too closely. Men who have been without warmth for long enough will accept a convincing simulation of it without asking too many questions about the source, not because they are foolish, because the alternative, acknowledging that what they are feeling might not be real, is a cost they are not yet willing to pay. Over the weeks that followed, Valentina wove herself into the fabric of his daily life with the patience of someone who understood that the strongest traps are the ones their targets build themselves. She did not push. She arrived reliably, warmly, consistently every morning with a good day message, every evening with a question or an observation or a small story from her day. She remembered things he had mentioned in passing and returned to them later. A contractor he had mentioned having trouble with, a recipe he said he was attempting, a documentary he had recommended. The effect of being remembered genuinely, specifically remembered on a man who had spent the last year feeling invisible in his own life, cannot be overstated. It is not a trick. It is simply the application of attention, which is among the most powerful currencies in human relationships, and which is most potent when directed at someone who has been running a deficit of it for years. He began to look forward to the calls the way he had once looked forward to nothing in particular. The days had a shape now. There was a before the call and an after the call, and the calls themselves 3, 4, 5 hours in the evenings, Tucson time, with Valentina sitting in her Cartagena apartment with a glass of something cold, felt more real, more textured, more emotionally inhabited than most of what occupied the hours between them. She had also, by this point, begun the long process of introducing the idea of Colombia as a place he could physically inhabit, not as an invitation that would have moved too fast for the profile she was running. As a casual observation, almost wistful. "You would really love Cartagena. I think it would change your mind about a lot of things," she said at once and did not return to it directly, but it planted itself. He started researching. She did not suggest the boutique hotel where Hector worked. She waited until he asked her for recommendations and then mentioned it among 3 others, specifically second, not first, because first would have seemed too convenient. The hotel was pleasant, reasonably priced for an American retiree, and positioned to allow Hector to make a preliminary assessment of Brent's financial disposition and emotional state before Valentina made her first in-person appearance. Brent booked his flights on a Friday afternoon in early spring. He sent Valentina a screenshot of the confirmation. She replied with a voice message, her voice warm, slightly breathless, as if she had not been expecting the news even though she had been managing toward it for weeks, saying she was so glad that Cartagena would take care of him, that she could not wait for him to finally see the city she had told him about. He listened to the voice message 4 times. He arrived in Cartagena on a Tuesday, in the thick, wet heat of a Caribbean morning, and the city received him the way cities sometimes do all at once, with a sensory generosity that makes everything else feel like a rehearsal. The old city rose behind its colonial walls in shades of yellow and terracotta and deep blue, bougainvillea cascading from balconies in riots of pink and orange, the streets narrow and cobbled and perpetually animated with the sound of vallenato drifting from open doorways, motorbikes threading through pedestrians with an ease that spoke of long negotiation between machines and human movement. The air smelled of the sea and frying food, and something floral he could not identify. After months of Tucson's dry, sun-bleached silence, the density of it, the color, the noise, the heat, the sheer aliveness hit him somewhere behind the sternum. He did not see Valentina on his first day. Hector had already identified him at check-in, an easy task. Given that Brent fit his profile with the precision of a man who had been designed for it, and had spent an hour that evening chatting with him at the hotel bar with the effortless sociability of someone who has made a profession of putting strangers at ease, Hector had learned in that hour that Brent owned his home outright, that his liquid savings were described as comfortable for now, though the divorce took a bite, and that he was in Cartagena specifically because of a woman he had met online whom he described with a slight self-consciousness that Hector clocked immediately as a friend, mostly. Hector had texted Valentina from the bathroom. The text read, "Confirmed. Proceed." She appeared on his second day. Framed as a coincidence, she was in the area for a work event at a hotel 2 streets from his, and she had thought, on impulse, that she would see if he wanted to get coffee. The impulse was not an impulse. but the staging was flawless. She arrived in a yellow dress and low sandals, her hair partially pinned, carrying a canvas bag with the logo of a wedding vendor, looking exactly like a woman who had come from something and was briefly, happily diverted. She was more beautiful in person than on any screen, which she had known would be the case, and which was the operational reason the in-person meeting was never rushed. The camera flattens. The body remembers differently. They had coffee that stretched into lunch, that stretched into a walk along the walls of the old city in the gold hour of late afternoon. She was the same woman he had known on the calls, warm, curious, unhurried, but now there was a physicality to her presence that recalibrated everything. The way she touched his arm briefly when she laughed. The way she stood close when she pointed something out on the old stone fortifications. The way she looked at him sometimes, directly, with a quality of evaluation that he read as possibility. He felt it in his body in a way that months of video calls, however meaningful, had not produced. By the end of that first afternoon, something in him had already decided. He did not call it love yet. He called it something he hadn't felt in a long time. The distinction was technically accurate and functionally meaningless. They spent 4 days together. She had arranged time away from her fabricated work obligations with a flexibility that she explained as, "It's a slower week. I don't usually get these." She showed him the city the way a person shows a place they love, with knowledge and tenderness and the specific pleasure of watching someone else encounter something for the first time. They ate in restaurants that had no menus, just whatever the kitchen had decided on that day. They took a boat out to one of the offshore islands and swam in water so clear it seemed artificially lit. On the evening of the third day, sitting on the hotel terrace with cold beers and the city sounds rising around them, something shifted between them in the manner of things that had been building for a long time, and finally tipped past the point of pretense. He did not sleep in his room on the third night. On the fourth day, she took him to meet her family, or rather to meet a family that had been partially prepared for his visit. Her mother was a small, smiling woman who pressed food on him with a maternal insistence that required no translation, a brother who worked construction and was studying English, an aunt and uncle who ran a small shop and asked about Arizona through Valentina's interpretation with what seemed like genuine warmth. The family was real. Portions of it were Valentina's actual relatives, adjusted slightly for operational purposes. The warmth was not entirely performed. This was the aspect of the work that Valentina found most complicated, and which she had long ago decided not to examine. Brent sat in that home and felt something he identified, with a fullness that surprised him, as belonging. He flew back to Tucson 1 week later carrying the particular weight of a man who has left part of himself somewhere else. The house, which had felt merely quiet before the trip, now felt actively empty in a way that had a different quality, not the absence of Linda, but the absence of everything Cartagena had briefly given him. He and Valentina talked every day. The calls had changed in texture, warmer, more intimate, colored now by physical memory in a way that gave everything said on screen a depth it had not had before. He told Craig on a Sunday call that he had met someone, that it was early, that he did not want to say too much yet. Craig said he was glad his dad was happy. Brent said he thought so too. 8 days after he returned, Valentina called him at an unusual hour, mid-afternoon, his time, which was not their pattern. He could see immediately, even before she spoke, that something was wrong. Her face on the screen was tight, with a controlled distress that he recognized as the particular look of a person trying not to fall apart. Her sister Daniela had been in a motorcycle accident on the way home from her nursing classes. She was in hospital. The doctors had been clear about what was needed, and equally clear about what it would cost before they would proceed. $4,000. The family did not have it. She was not asking him, she said this twice, that she was not asking, that she just needed to tell someone, that she was ashamed to even be on this call, but there was no one else she could tell, and she did not know what to do. He sent the money before the call ended. Western Union the same afternoon. She cried in a way that seemed to empty her. She said she would pay him back. He said it was not necessary. She said he did not understand how much this meant to her. He said he did, a little. What he felt, after that call ended, was not diminished by $4,000. What he felt was the specific warmth of someone who has been needed and has answered. He was, for the first time since Linda had left, the man he had always believed himself to be. Daniela recovered. Valentina sent him a photograph from the hospital, her sister, pale and tired but smiling, holding a phone with a thumbs up aimed at the camera. He saved the photograph. He did not know that Daniela had been sent a message by her sister telling her to take a photograph in a particular way, holding a phone at a particular angle, because a foreign man who had helped with a crisis needed to see evidence of a good outcome. Daniela had not asked why. She had learned not to ask why. 3 weeks after the medical emergency, Valentina arrived on a video call in a different mood lighter, excited in a carefully contained way, like someone sitting on good news they are not sure they should share. She had heard, through a colleague in the events industry, about a real estate opportunity, a development outside Medellin vacation units pre-sale phase being offered to a small number of foreign investors at below-market prices before the public launch. Her colleague had already invested a modest amount. The documentation looked legitimate. The projected returns, if the development proceeded as planned, were significant. She was thinking of putting in some of her own savings. She was cautious about it, she said, because she had never done anything like this before. But the numbers seemed real, and her colleague was trustworthy. She mentioned it the way one mentions something to a person whose professional judgment one respects. She was not suggesting Brent invest. She was thinking out loud to someone who understood construction and development in a way she did not. He asked her to send him the documents. They arrived the next day, a prospectus, professionally designed, with photographs of the development site, architectural renderings of the completed units, projected revenue figures, and a signed contract template. Rodrigo Peña Vargas, who handled documentation for the sale with the methodical precision of a man who had once worked in graphic design and found his skills applicable in unexpected directions, had spent 11 days producing the materials. They were layered onto the visual identity of a legitimate Medellin development company, the name slightly altered. The logos close enough to survive a cursory search, the notarial stamps convincing to anyone who was not a retired Colombian attorney. Brent studied the documents with the professional attention of an engineer who had reviewed construction contracts for 3 decades. He found nothing that troubled him. The numbers were plausible. The development model was consistent with what he knew about resort real estate in emerging tourist markets. The projected returns were not outlandishly high. Whoever had designed this had been careful to stay within the range of credibility. He asked 2 questions about the equity structure. Rodrigo, posing as the developer's representative in a WhatsApp exchange that Valentina facilitated, answered them correctly and in the right technical register. He invested $22,000 across 2 bank transfers over the following 10 days. A signed contract arrived by email within 48 hours. An investment confirmation document followed. He saved them in a folder on his desktop. He felt the familiar satisfaction of a decision well-researched and executed the same feeling he had gotten for 30 years from a project that had been properly planned. Valentina, when he told her he had decided to invest, expressed a warmth that contained relief, though he could not have identified the specific quality of it. She said she was glad. She said she trusted his judgment more than her own on these things. She said that felt like another reason she was lucky to know him. The weeks that followed had a rhythm that Brent later described as the best period of his adult life since his children were young, which is the detail, in retrospect, that most clearly measures the depth of what was taken from him. 2 smaller emergencies arrived and passed. A plumbing failure in Valentina's apartment that required urgent repair $1,200, returned quickly and with profuse apology and gratitude. A legal fee connected to her late uncle's estate, a matter of inheritance paperwork that Colombian bureaucracy had made unexpectedly complicated $1,800. Again, neither amount was large enough to trigger alarm on its own. Together, they added $3,000 to the running total, which Brent was not consciously tracking because he was not thinking of himself as a man in a financial transaction. He was thinking of himself as a man in a relationship, helping someone he loved navigate the ordinary disasters of life. The framing was everything. Each crisis was not a withdrawal. It was an opportunity to demonstrate once again that he was the kind of man who showed up. He flew back to Cartagena 6 weeks after his first visit. Valentina met him at the hotel. They spent 10 days together, and if the first visit had confirmed the connection, the second one deepened it in ways that felt permanent. They talked about what a shared life might look like, not with the theatrical urgency of people who are afraid of the answer, but with the quiet seriousness of people who are beginning to believe the answer might actually exist. He mentioned on one evening that he had told his daughter Megan about her. He did not say how Megan had responded. Valentina did not ask. When he returned to Tucson, the distance had a different quality, not the empty ache of before, but the bearable longing of someone who knows what they are waiting for. He was 58 years old and he was in love. And he had an investment in Colombia that was generating quarterly update emails with increasingly promising figures. He was, by every internal measure he possessed, a man whose life was going in the right direction for the first time in years. The developer contacted him 6 weeks after his second return. The email was professional, detailed, warmly congratulatory. As an existing investor, Brent was being offered first access to the second phase of the development, a second tranche of units, higher floors, superior view positions, with a projected return that outperformed the first phase by a meaningful margin. The window was limited. The developer's representative, the same man, the same precise and technically fluent voice Brent had exchanged messages with before, followed up the email with a WhatsApp message answering the questions Brent had not yet asked. $38,000. That was the investment required to secure a second phase unit. Brent sat with it for 3 days. The number was significant. It would bring his total investment to $60,000, nearly 2/3 of his remaining liquid savings. He was not a reckless man. He ran the numbers, reviewed the contracts, looked at the quarterly updates. The logical case for caution was real. Then Valentina called. She had not called to discuss the investment. She had called to share her own news. She had decided, after a lot of thought, to put her own savings into the second phase. She was nervous about it, she said. It was more than she was comfortable with. But she believed in the development, and she had seen what the first phase was producing, and she thought, frankly, that it was time to stop being afraid of opportunities. She did not tell him what to do. She did not mention that she had been informed of his hesitation. She simply shared her own decision with the slightly exposed quality of someone who is not asking for validation but would not refuse it. He transferred the $38,000 the following morning. The developer went dark on a Thursday. There was no dramatic disappearance, just a cessation of response. Emails delivered, unreturned. WhatsApp messages checked but not replied to. Brent waited 48 hours before trying Valentina, telling himself there was a reasonable explanation, that these things happened in international business, that he was not panicking, that he was simply verifying. Valentina answered. She sounded confused, then frightened, then controlled in the specific way of someone trying to manage their own fear, which is what he saw, because it was what she showed him. She said she had been trying to reach the developer too. She said she was sure there was an explanation. She said she would find out what was happening. She called him twice more over the next 2 days, brief, worried, real-sounding, with nothing to report. Then the WhatsApp messages showed a single gray tick, undelivered. He called her number. The automated message was in Spanish, clipped and impersonal. The number he had dialed was not in service. He tried again. Same message. He went to her Facebook profile and found nothing. Not a locked page, not a deactivated notice. Simply nothing. The URL resolved to a blank. Her WhatsApp account was gone. The wedding events company listed in her profile, he had looked it up before, confirmed it was a real business, which it was, had never employed anyone by her name. As a follow-up call to their office, made in a mixture of English and translated questions, quickly established. He sat at the kitchen island in Tucson where he had been sitting alone for 2 years, and he did not move for a very long time. He eventually called an old colleague, a retired attorney named Paul, a man he had known through a professional association for 20 years and trusted without reservation. He sent Paul the investment contract. He explained the situation in the flat, careful voice of a man who is reporting a structural failure and needs the assessment to be accurate before he decides how to respond. Paul called him back in 40 minutes. He had found 3 forged notarial stamps. He was quiet about it, because Paul was also a careful man. He said, "Brent, this is a fraud document. I'm sorry." Brent said, "I know." He had known for several hours. He had simply been waiting for someone else to confirm what he already understood. because hearing it in his own head and hearing it from another human being are two different kinds of real. He went to bed at 7 o'clock. He lay in the dark of the house that used to hold a marriage and stared at the ceiling and felt something that was not grief and not anger, but some precise compound of them that had its own specific gravity, the weight. $67,000 and 14 months of feeling chosen, evaporating simultaneously. But what pressed down hardest in the dark was not the money. It was the memory of telling Megan he had met someone. The memory of the photograph of Daniela in the hospital bed with a thumbs up. The memory of standing on the walls of Cartagena in the late afternoon light, feeling for the first time in longer than he could measure like a man with something ahead of him. All of it performance. All of it aimed. He filed a report with the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center the following week and a separate notification with the U.S. Embassy in Bogotá. A consular officer called him back within 10 days with a careful, practiced sympathy that communicated, without stating it directly, that the volume of similar complaints was high and the likelihood of recovery was low. Colombian law enforcement was notified. The case joined a backlog that stretched back years. Rodrigo moved to Cali with the efficiency of a man who had practiced this exit. Valentina flew to Ecuador. She had a contact there, a city she knew, a place to wait out the standard dispersal period. Hector closed down his operations at the hotel with a plausible cover story about family obligations and relocated within the week. Monica, who had already converted and dispersed the funds through 4 accounts across 2 countries, went back to her quiet life in Bucaramanga and did not change her routine at all. No arrests were made. The cell reconvened 8 months later under adjusted identities and a revised operational profile. The work continued. Brent's daughter Megan learned about the fraud from Craig, who learned about it from Brent on a Sunday call that went longer than usual. Megan called her father the following day. The conversation was not warm. She had never been warm about his life after the divorce, and she had processed his mention of someone I've been talking to in Colombia as additional evidence of a pattern she had already formed an opinion about. The fact that the woman turned out not to be real did not, in Megan's handling of it, produce sympathy so much as a kind of grim confirmation. They did not speak for 7 months. Craig was gentler. Craig came to Tucson for a weekend in the month after it happened and fixed a gate on Brent's fence that had been hanging wrong for a year. And they ate takeout pizza on the deck and did not talk about Colombia directly, but sat in the kind of company that does not require conversation to be companionable. It was, Brent would later say, the most useful thing anyone did for him in that period. He lost $67,000, nearly 3/4 of his liquid savings. His home was intact. His pension covered his costs. He was not financially ruined in the absolute sense. But retirement, which had already been modest, was now genuinely constrained. No room for error, no room for the international life he had briefly imagined. No room, really, for anything beyond stability. At 58, there was no professional second act available to replenish what had been taken. The math was done. That chapter was closed. He did not seek therapy immediately. He withdrew instead, became more quiet, more self-contained, more inclined toward a dry and slightly bitter commentary on human nature that his friends found vaguely unsettling because it did not sound like him. He had been, before all of this, a man capable of optimism. Not naive optimism, the working kind, the kind that builds things. That quality did not return quickly. 18 months after the incident, he joined a grief recovery group officially organized around divorce, unofficially serving as a container for the broader accumulation of loss that men of his age and background rarely have language for. He did not talk about Colombia for the first 4 sessions. When he did, he was matter-of-fact. He said he had been professionally targeted by people who understood what he needed and had manufactured it precisely. He said he did not think he had been uniquely stupid. He said he thought he had been uniquely lonely, and that those were different things, and that the difference mattered, though he could not always articulate why. The group, to its credit, agreed. What happened to Valentina is not the ending that most people want for this story, which is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about it. She met her internal financial target 14 months after the operation involving Brent concluded. She returned to Medellin. She invested in a small cafe and retail space in the Laurelleys neighborhood, the same area where she had grown up watching her mother work 3 jobs to stay in an apartment they eventually lost anyway. She co-owns the business with Daniela, who manages the day-to-day while completing her nursing degree. The business does adequately. The sisters are close. Their mother visits on Sundays. Valentina does not think about Brent Sampson by name. She thinks about that period of her life the way people think about a version of themselves they have since outgrown, with a recognition that stops short of examination. Whether the wall she built between who she was then and who she is now is as structural as she believes it to be, is something only time and circumstances not yet arrived will test. She has never been asked directly. She is not sure she wants to be. In Tucson, Brent finished the garden project he started the winter after the Colombia story ended. He does not travel internationally. He watches videos about Colombia, sometimes the food, the music, the architecture, the coast he only partially saw, and feels something that he cannot name cleanly. A compound of memory and anger and something that is almost, but not quite, tenderness. He joined the grief group. He has not tried to meet anyone. He tells himself he is not closed to it. Most days, he believes that. The deck is good. The gate Craig fixed still holds. The pension comes in, the same amount, the same day, every month, and it is enough. It is enough. The story of Brent Sampson is not, at its core, a story about a man who was foolish. It is a story about what happens when a person's deepest need, the need to matter, to be seen, to be necessary to someone, is identified and manufactured with professional precision by people who understand that emotion is not a weakness, but a mechanism, and that mechanisms can be operated by anyone who takes the time to learn how they work. Romance fraud is not a crime of opportunity. It is a crime of research. The cell that targeted Brent spent weeks understanding who he was before Valentina typed a single word. They knew what he had lost and what that loss had created in him. They built their approach around that knowledge with a patience and a craft that, in a different context, would constitute genuine skill. If you are watching this and you have recently experienced significant loss, a divorce, a retirement, a bereavement, a period of isolation, please understand that these transitions make all of us temporarily more vulnerable to exactly this kind of targeting. Not because we become stupid, because we become human in a way we usually keep better protected. If someone you have met online, however genuine they seem, however many months of warmth have accumulated between you, begins to involve financial emergencies, medical crises, legal fees, investment opportunities with limited windows before you have met them in person and verified their life with your own eyes, stop. Not because every person who has ever asked for help online is fraudulent, but because the cost of caution is a conversation. The cost of trust, in cases like this one, is everything. Brent Sampson sent this story in because he wanted at least one person to read it before they made the same transfer. If you are that person, then something good has come from what happened to him. He would tell you himself, but he is in Tucson, and he is fine, and that is enough to know.